Meghan and Harry back in the UK for the first time since announcing their split from the royal family. For more on this first big trip, we are bringing in Diane Clehane, the royals editor for Best Life. And Diane, run us through. We are fascinated with them. How are they spending their time there? And is this kind of a farewell tour of sorts before their status officially changes next month?
Well, it's great to be with you again, Allison. Yes, it is their unofficial farewell tour. But interestingly enough, Meghan touched down literally just before this event and was staying at the Goring Hotel rather than Frogmore Cottage. She wants to sort of get in and out of there quickly, and they do have quite a few events planned. But today was the first one. This evening was the first one. Is it true that Archie is not on this trip? That's what we've been hearing. Archie is not on the trip, and I think it's really something that the Brits are up in arms about. And I did a story just recently where a source told me that the Queen was quite saddened by it. They haven't seen that child since November, and the Duke of Edinburgh is in very failing health. The Queen is obviously 93, and they haven't seen this child, and chances are they won't be seeing much of him after this.
I was going to ask you, now that the dust has settled, how's the royal family taking this break? But I guess I should ask you to begin with, has the dust really settled?
You know what? It's really sort of an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
The interesting part will be when they all are together at the Commonwealth Day services, which is March 9th. I think the Brits are going to be having lip readers and everybody else that they can sort of have there to decipher what the body language is telling us.
Yeah.
But the Queen has given, according to my sources, the Queen has given the marching orders, which is, you know, keep calm and carry on. They want to put out a united front because this has just taken way too much oxygen out of the whole thing.
At a recent event, the prince joked, "Call me Harry," but in all seriousness, what will we be calling them going forward?
Well, I think that's sort of an indication of what they want to do.
Yeah.
They cannot use their HRH titles.
Right.
I think that people are always going to call Harry Prince Harry, whether he likes it or not.
Right.
But it
kind of
seems
sticks,
odd.
right?
Yeah. And it seems very odd to call Meghan Duchess Meghan. So I think Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are pretty much what they're going to go by.
Diane, I have to ask you, I know this is kind of the million-dollar question everyone wants to know, but any signs or any indications that perhaps the relationship with Harry and William is any better, or that how things are with Meghan and Kate? I know everyone wants to know, are they getting along? Are they not getting along? Has this tension sort of broken those relationships irreparably?
I think there's some irreparable damage that's been done. I mean, they haven't spent any time together. I think what's interesting is that this whole Megxit thing has brought different people closer. Charles is closer to William by far. He was really not as close as Harry was to Charles. Harry was really the one that was closest to Charles. So, and again, Charles was her champion. So that's a very interesting thing. And I think that Kate has really stepped up. I think this has brought Kate and William together in a much bigger way. But as far as Harry and William go, I think there's a problem there. I mean, William is going to need someone when he becomes king, and just like Margaret was to Queen Elizabeth, and he's not going to have that.
Yeah, oh, it's such a tough thing to see. Whether it's a royal family or any family, it's always tough to see when there are divisions between brothers. It is a story that has fascinated us, Diane. I know we'll be talking to you about this again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.